Before fear had a name, before warnings were ever written, something was already wrong. Not violently, not loudly, just wrong enough to go unnoticed. The story of Annabelle does not begin with chaos or terror, but with a quiet deviation from normality, small enough to be ignored, subtle enough to be rationalized. In an ordinary American apartment, nothing appeared dangerous at first glance. There were no symbols, no rituals, no immediate sense of threat. Yet from the moment the doll crossed the threshold of that space, the environment began to shift in ways that defied clear explanation. This is the detail most retellings overlook. The disturbance did not announce itself. It blended in. And by the time anyone questioned it, the process was already underway, slowly rewriting the rules of what felt safe and familiar. Annabelle arrived as a gift, given without suspicion, chosen for its simplicity and harmless appearance. A Raggedy Ann doll, mass-produced, soft to the touch, stitched with a permanent smile that suggested comfort rather than danger. It was placed casually on a bed, left there as one might leave any childhood object. For days, nothing happened, or at least nothing obvious. Life continued in predictable rhythms. Work, sleep, conversation, silence. But subtle inconsistencies began to emerge. The doll was no longer where it had been left. At first, these moments were dismissed without effort. A misplaced object meant nothing. Memory is unreliable. Assumptions are easier than questions. Yet the movements continued. The doll appeared in different rooms, positioned upright when it had been left lying down, balanced in ways that defied the limitations of fabric and stuffing. These changes were not dramatic enough to inspire fear, but they were consistent enough to plant doubt. And doubt, once introduced, has a way of growing quietly in the background of the mind. As days turned into weeks, the apartment itself seemed to respond to the doll's presence. Doors were found closed without explanation. Rooms felt colder, heavier, as if the air resisted movement. Visitors remarked on the atmosphere without being prompted, describing a sensation of discomfort they could not articulate. Some felt watched. Others experienced sudden headaches or nausea. These reactions were spontaneous, not shared in advance, and they followed a pattern that became impossible to ignore. The doll itself remained unchanged in appearance, but its influence extended beyond physical movement. It altered perception. It altered mood. This distinction is critical. Annabelle did not rely on spectacle. The environment became the message. And the message was subtle, persistent unease. The longer the doll remained, the more the apartment felt like a place that resisted being occupied, as if it no longer belonged entirely to the people living there. The first clear sign of intent came in the form of handwritten notes. Short messages appeared without warning, written on parchment-like paper that none of the occupants recognized. Phrases such as "help us" and "help Lou" were found in different rooms, often near the doll itself. The problem was not only the content of the notes, but their existence. No one owned parchment paper. None had purchased it. No source could be identified. The handwriting did not match anyone in the apartment. Searches were conducted. Nothing was found. The notes continued to appear regardless. At this stage, the situation crossed a psychological threshold. Objects moving could be ignored. Feelings could be dismissed. But messages implied intention. Communication suggested awareness, and awareness introduced the possibility of something actively engaging with the space and the people inside it. Still, fear was restrained. The idea that a doll could be responsible felt unreasonable, almost embarrassing to consider. Rational explanations were preferred, even as they became increasingly fragile. The escalation was gradual, as if whatever presence existed was testing limits. Sounds were heard at night. Soft at first, then more deliberate. The doll was found in places it could not have reached on its own. Visitors began refusing to stay. One individual, Lou, reacted more strongly than the others. From the beginning, he expressed a deep discomfort around the doll, a sense of hostility he could not explain. His reactions were not theatrical, they were instinctive. One night he experienced what would later be described as the first physical attack. He woke suddenly, unable to move, feeling an intense pressure on his chest. In the dim light of the room, he saw the doll positioned near him before losing consciousness. When he awoke, he was bleeding. Claw-like marks covered his chest, appearing suddenly, without any sign of a weapon or intruder. The wounds healed faster than expected, leaving confusion alongside fear. This incident marked the end of denial. The activity was no longer passive. Something had crossed from influence into harm. Desperate for answers, the occupants sought help from a psychic medium, hoping to understand what they were dealing with. The explanation they received seemed, at first, almost comforting. The medium claimed the doll was inhabited by the spirit of a young girl named Annabelle Higgins, who had died years earlier. According to this account, the spirit was lonely, seeking companionship, and meant no harm. Believing they were helping a lost child, the occupants made a decision that would define the entire case. They gave permission for the spirit to remain attached to the doll. This moment is critical. In paranormal investigation, consent is not symbolic, it is functional. By agreeing to the presence, they removed the final barrier. What they believed to be an act of kindness was, in reality, an invitation. And invitations, once accepted, are rarely withdrawn without consequence. Almost immediately after this permission was granted, the activity intensified. The atmosphere in the apartment became oppressive. Fear was no longer occasional, it was constant. The doll's presence dominated the space, influencing emotions, provoking anxiety, and isolating those who lived there. At this point, experienced paranormal investigators were contacted. Their assessment was swift and unambiguous. They concluded that no human spirit was involved. Human spirits, they explained, do not possess objects. What inhabited the doll was a non-human entity, one that had used the illusion of innocence to gain trust and access. The story of a child was a manipulation, a strategy. The entity's goal was attachment, not companionship, control, not coexistence. The doll was never the source of the activity. It was the conduit. The investigators removed Annabelle from the apartment, but even during transport, incidents were reported. The vehicle carrying the doll malfunctioned repeatedly, brakes failing without mechanical explanation. Only through constant vigilance and prayer did they reach their destination safely. Upon arrival, the doll was isolated and secured, contained within a controlled environment to limit its influence. But containment is not resolution. The origin of Annabelle does not end with her removal. It ends with understanding. Annabelle was never simply a haunted object. She was a doorway, carefully disguised, patiently waiting to be opened. And once opened, the consequences could not be undone. This is where the story truly begins. Containment did not bring silence, it brought attention. Once Annabelle was removed from the apartment, the assumption was that distance would neutralize influence. That assumption proved dangerously incomplete. The investigators who took custody of the doll understood that objects like this do not lose power through relocation alone. Influence changes shape. It adapts to proximity, intention, and awareness. During the journey away from the apartment, mechanical failures began almost immediately. The vehicle stalled without warning. The brakes locked unexpectedly. At one point, control was nearly lost on a clear road under normal conditions. These incidents were not random enough to dismiss, yet not dramatic enough to attract public attention. They occurred in the precise space where doubt thrives. To counter this, verbal prayer was maintained throughout the remainder of the transport, not as ritual, but as containment. The journey ended without catastrophe, but the message was clear. Separation had not ended interaction. It had only shifted it. Upon arrival, the doll was placed in a controlled environment designed to limit exposure. Physical barriers were established, not because they were believed to be absolute, but because they created psychological and procedural distance. The space was quiet, structured, and deliberately uninviting. Over time, however, reports continued to surface. Individuals who came near the doll described sensations consistent with earlier accounts: pressure in the chest, sudden dread, disorientation, and intrusive thoughts that did not feel self-generated. These reactions were strongest in those who approached with curiosity rather than caution. This pattern is significant. The influence did not rely on fear alone. It responded to attention. Awareness functioned as a form of access. Those who treated the doll as an object experienced less effect than those who treated it as a presence. This distinction would later become a foundational principle in understanding the case. The decision was made to isolate Annabelle further, enclosing her within a glass case. This was not merely symbolic. The case functioned as a boundary, both physical and psychological. It established rules of interaction. Do not touch. Do not provoke. Do not engage. A warning was placed clearly on the exterior, not to dramatize but to discourage curiosity. Despite this, incidents continued. A visiting individual reportedly mocked the warnings, striking the glass and treating the containment as superstition. Shortly after leaving the premises, he was involved in a serious motorcycle accident. While causation could not be definitively established, the timing and pattern mirrored earlier events. Nearness, dismissal, consequence. These sequences were noted, documented, and added to the growing archive surrounding the doll. Over time, the pattern became difficult to ignore. Annabelle did not act randomly. The responses were situational, reactive, and precise. What makes this phase of the story critical is not escalation, but consistency. The influence did not grow louder, it grew clearer. There were no dramatic manifestations, no public displays designed to attract attention. Instead, there was repetition. The same types of reactions, the same emotional responses, the same physical sensations. Individuals described feeling compelled to approach the case, drawn without understanding why. Others reported dreams involving the doll, despite never having focused on it consciously. These dreams shared common elements: paralysis, observation, a sense of being evaluated rather than attacked. This detail is essential. Fear was present but secondary. The primary sensation was exposure. As if something was aware, attentive, and patient. The doll remained motionless, unchanged, but the experiences around it suggested an intelligence operating within constraints. Investigators concluded that the entity associated with Annabelle functioned through permission and proximity. Permission did not require verbal consent. It could be granted through curiosity, attention, or dismissal. Proximity did not require physical contact. Awareness alone was often sufficient. This understanding reframed the entire case. The doll was not dangerous because it moved or attacked. It was dangerous because it invited engagement. The illusion of innocence remained its most effective mechanism. By appearing harmless, it lowered defenses. By remaining passive, it avoided detection. This is why the early stages were so difficult to interpret. Nothing overtly malicious occurred at first. The danger was cumulative. Small interactions layered over time, gradually eroding boundaries until influence became unavoidable. As documentation expanded, the case took on a different significance. Annabelle was no longer viewed as an isolated incident, but as an example of a broader category of phenomena. Objects that serve as focal points, conduits rather than sources. The entity associated with the doll demonstrated no interest in spectacle. Its actions suggested long-term attachment rather than immediate harm. This explains why removal did not end activity. The goal was never the apartment. It was access. The doll provided that access efficiently and quietly. Containment reduced interaction, but it did not eliminate potential. The presence remained stable, dormant but responsive. This state was considered preferable to escalation, but it required constant vigilance. The case shifted from investigation to maintenance, from reaction to prevention. The most unsettling aspect of this phase is not what happened, but what did not. There were no dramatic final confrontations, no definitive closure. The activity stabilized, but the potential remained. The doll stayed where it was placed, behind glass, accompanied by warnings that grew more serious over time. Visitors continued to react. Documentation continued to grow. The story did not end. It paused. This is the reality often omitted from simplified retellings. There was no resolution, only containment. And containment, by definition, acknowledges that what is held still exists. The second phase of Annabelle's story is not about escalation. It is about endurance, a prolonged demonstration that some presences do not need to act to be effective. They only need to remain. Time did not weaken the presence associated with Annabelle. If anything, it refined it. As years passed, the doll became less an active disturbance and more a constant variable, unchanging, observant, and quietly influential. The lack of dramatic escalation led some to assume the threat had diminished. This assumption would become another recurring error. The entity connected to Annabelle did not rely on force, it relied on patience. Investigators noted that prolonged containment created a false sense of safety, both for those responsible for maintaining the object and for those who came into indirect contact with it. Stability was mistaken for neutrality, but stability in this context meant something else entirely. It meant the situation had reached a functional equilibrium. The presence no longer needed to test boundaries. The boundaries were known. As documentation accumulated, a clearer psychological profile began to emerge, not of the doll, but of the effect it produced on human perception. Individuals exposed to Annabelle for extended periods reported subtle cognitive changes, increased anxiety without identifiable cause, difficulty concentrating, recurring intrusive thoughts that felt foreign in origin. These symptoms were often dismissed as stress or suggestion, yet they followed a consistent trajectory. The longer the exposure, the more persistent the effects. Importantly, these reactions occurred even in individuals who did not believe in paranormal phenomena. Skepticism did not provide immunity. In some cases, it appeared to increase vulnerability. Those who dismissed the warnings were more likely to linger, more likely to engage, and more likely to rationalize sensations instead of withdrawing. This pattern reinforced a central conclusion. Belief was not required. Attention was enough. The doll's reputation began to spread, not through media, but through word of mouth among those who had encountered it directly. These accounts were rarely dramatic. They were restrained, hesitant, and often shared reluctantly. Many described an instinctive reluctance to talk about the experience afterward, as if verbalizing it prolonged exposure. This reluctance itself became a point of interest. Silence appeared to function as a form of self-protection. Investigators observed that individuals who fixated on the doll, through repeated discussion, research, or personal reflection, reported more persistent effects. Those who disengaged entirely recovered more quickly. This reinforced the theory that the entity's influence extended beyond physical proximity. Cognitive engagement served as a secondary channel. Thinking about the object sustained connection. Ignoring it weakened that connection. This dynamic reframed containment strategy. Physical isolation was no longer considered sufficient. Informational restraint became equally important. Despite precautions, incidents continued to occur, though rarely in ways that could be conclusively linked. Accidents involving visitors, sudden illnesses following close proximity, emotional breakdowns without clear triggers. None of these events could be proven as direct consequences, yet the pattern was statistically abnormal. Investigators documented each case without speculation, focusing instead on correlation. Over time, the archive revealed repetition. The same sequence appeared again and again. Exposure, dismissal, delayed consequence. The delay was crucial. Immediate effects would have made causation obvious. Delay created ambiguity. Ambiguity allowed doubt. Doubt allowed continued interaction. The structure of these events suggested intentional design. The entity did not seek acknowledgement. It benefited from uncertainty. What troubled investigators most during this phase was the absence of escalation. Harm occurred, but not catastrophically. There were no fatalities definitively attributed to the doll. No public crises. This restraint indicated control. The presence did not act impulsively. It acted selectively. The lack of overt violence preserved access. A dramatic incident would have forced removal, destruction, or permanent isolation. Instead, the entity maintained a level of activity low enough to remain tolerated, yet high enough to remain effective. This balance required intelligence. It also required long-term planning. The doll was not a tool of chaos. It was a mechanism of influence operating under self-imposed limits. As awareness of the case grew, external pressure increased. Some questioned why the object was not destroyed. Others argued that destruction could release whatever was attached. The decision to maintain containment was based on risk assessment rather than certainty. There was no reliable method to neutralize the presence without potential escalation. Containment, imperfect as it was, offered predictability. The entity's behavior within constraints was understood. Outside those constraints, outcomes were unknown. This decision underscores a critical reality often ignored in simplified narratives. Investigators were not seeking victory. They were seeking control. The goal was not to eliminate the threat, but to manage it. This distinction changes how the entire case is interpreted. During this period, the doll became a symbol, not publicly, but within investigative circles. It represented a category of phenomena that defied conventional classification. Not poltergeist, not possession in the traditional sense, not residual energy. It was adaptive, responsive, a presence that functioned through interaction rather than force. Annabelle was no longer viewed as an anomaly. She was considered an example, a reference point. Other cases began to be compared against her profile. Similar patterns were identified elsewhere, though rarely with the same level of documentation. This elevated the significance of the case beyond its immediate events. Annabelle became a benchmark for understanding how non-human entities establish and maintain influence over time. Perhaps the most unsettling conclusion drawn during this phase was that the doll itself was irrelevant. The fabric, the stitching, the appearance, all incidental. Any object could have served the same function. Annabelle was chosen not for what she was, but for what she represented. Innocence, familiarity, trust. The entity exploited these associations flawlessly. By inhabiting something that appeared harmless, it bypassed instinctive defenses. This realization forced a broader reconsideration of how danger is identified. Threats do not always announce themselves through fear. Sometimes they present comfort, familiarity, a smile. The third phase of Annabelle's story is not defined by new events, but by deepening understanding. The realization that the most dangerous aspect was not what happened, but what was allowed to continue happening quietly, over time, without resolution. The final phase of the Annabelle case was never marked by a single event. There was no definitive incident that signaled an ending, no moment that could be isolated and labeled as closure. Instead, the conclusion emerged gradually, shaped by accumulated understanding rather than dramatic resolution. Investigators came to accept that the situation they were managing was not one that could be solved in a conventional sense. The presence associated with Annabelle did not behave like a problem awaiting elimination. It behaved like a condition, persistent, adaptive, and resistant to finality. This realization fundamentally altered how the case was approached. The objective shifted from control to coexistence within strict boundaries. The question was no longer how to end the influence, but how to prevent it from expanding. Over time, the procedures surrounding the doll became ritualized, not out of superstition, but out of necessity. Interaction protocols were formalized. Exposure was limited. Documentation was prioritized over experimentation. Every deviation from routine was recorded, no matter how minor. This methodical approach produced an unexpected outcome: predictability. The presence responded consistently to reduced attention. Activity diminished when interaction ceased. When curiosity increased, subtle effects returned. This cause and effect relationship, though never absolute, was reliable enough to guide behavior. The entity did not retaliate against neglect. It receded. This contradicted many assumptions about malicious forces, which are often imagined as aggressive and reactive. Instead, what investigators observed was conditional engagement. The presence required participation. Without it, influence weakened. This understanding led to one of the most important conclusions of the entire case. Annabelle was not powerful because of what she could do, but because of what people allowed her to do. The danger was not unilateral, it was relational. Influence existed in the space between object and observer. This reframing placed responsibility not on the entity alone, but on human behavior. Attention, belief, dismissal, curiosity. These were not neutral actions. They shaped outcomes. This is why the case resisted resolution. As long as humans remained involved, Some degree of influence was inevitable. Total disengagement was the only effective deterrent, yet total disengagement was difficult to maintain. The doll's very existence invited fascination, and fascination, even when restrained, created openings. As years passed, the public narrative surrounding Annabelle diverged sharply from the documented reality. Popular retellings emphasized spectacle, violence, and cinematic exaggeration. The real case, by contrast, was defined by restraint. There were no constant manifestations, no escalating attacks. What made the situation unsettling was its endurance. The presence did not fade, it did not weaken, it simply remained, contained but intact. This endurance suggested a form of patience that exceeded human time frames. Investigators noted that the entity showed no urgency. There was no rush to act, no compulsion to escalate. It behaved as if time itself was an advantage. This observation challenged the assumption that danger must be immediate to be real. In this case, danger was distributed across years, expressed through small, cumulative effects rather than singular catastrophes. Eventually, the decision was made to limit discussion of the case to essential documentation only. Public exposure was minimized. The doll remained secured, accompanied by warnings that were intentionally understated. The goal was deterrence without provocation. Sensationalism was avoided. The fewer people who engaged with the object, the lower the incidence of reported effects. This strategy proved effective. Activity stabilized at minimal levels. No new patterns emerged. The case entered a state best described as dormancy. Not inactive, but quiet. This state has persisted for decades. The absence of escalation has led some to question whether the threat was ever real. Investigators reject this conclusion. Dormancy is not absence. It is containment functioning as intended. The final assessment of the Annabelle case does not offer comfort. It offers clarity. The doll was never the threat. The threat was the mechanism it represented. A reminder that influence does not require force, that danger does not require drama, and that permission can be granted without awareness. Annabelle's story endures not because of what happened, but because of what continues to be possible. The case remains unresolved by design. Resolution would imply finality. Finality has never been demonstrated. Instead, the lesson persists quietly, embedded in procedure and restraint. Some doors once opened cannot be closed. They can only be guarded. And guarding requires vigilance, discipline, and the willingness to accept that not every story ends with an ending. This is where the record stops. Not because the story is over, but because continuing to look has consequences.